did you ever notice how often boats are mentioned? We have Jesus using a boat as a marine pulpit when the crowd pressed him on the shore. And then he tells Peter to row out into the deep so they can catch the great draft of fish. You recall Jesus walking on the water late at night while the disciples were in a boat. You recall the stilling of the tempest when Jesus was able somehow to sleep through the storm until they awakened him. Has a boat been discovered which Jesus and the disciples could have used? Well, here's the story on that. It was in the spring of 1986. No rain had fallen in Galilee for weeks on end. Very dry spring, and therefore the water level of the Sea of Galilee starts dropping. And this exposed a vast gravelly halo around the shoreline of the sea. One evening, two brothers from Kibbutz Ginosar, you notice how Gennesaret shows up in that name, were out exploring this new sea bottom, and they noticed that in the gravel there was a pointy object of wood which flared back along a railing to a stern 26.5 feet further back, and the stern was 7 feet wide, and therefore it looked for all the world like the gunnels or the top of a buried ship hull. Was it a hull? Well, they carefully started grubbing away, and they noticed the wood went down further and further, and indeed it was a submerged hull. They thought probably it came from the Middle Ages, maybe the 1500s. They weren't sure, but what they did do was to immediately call in the marine archaeologists, and they explored the further subterranean area around the hull and liberated it. Well, or did they? Murphy's Law took over. The rains came, and now the Sea of Galilee rises. And so they had to surround this discovery with gunny sacks in which they had put sandbagged a cofferdam around this excavation, worked 3 shifts of archaeologists, 24 hours, 8-hour shifts, and in 11 days they liberated this hull. Then immediately they surrounded it with a fiberglass cocoon and then sailed this whole affair on shore because at their kibbutz, you'll not believe this, they had meanwhile built a huge aquarium for it so they could resubmerge these ruins again in Sea of Galilee water, because otherwise the wood would have desiccated, dried out, and turned to dust. So then when they had resubmerged it, they cataloged every last board, and then they called in the world's ranking marine archaeologist to help date this find. He flew in from Texas, would you believe? And he immediately said this has got to be 1st century BC or 1st century AD. How did he know that? Well, he said it was a mortise and tenon construction used along the sides of the boat, which was done only at that time. Well, to make sure, they then did a carbon-14 test of the hull, and there were, of course, a little problems there, 72 different kinds of wood, but it averaged out at about 20 or 30 BC. So suddenly they realized the hull was 1,500 years earlier than they thought, and indeed, this was the kind of fishing boat hull that was around during Jesus' time. Now, did Jesus and the disciples use that very ship? Folks, there's no brand on the hull that says belonging to Simon Bar-Jonah Enterprises, Sons of Zebedee Incorporated, or even better, there's no bronze plaque that says Jesus slept here. But it is the kind of boat they could have used. And actually, if you push me up against a wall and say, is it within the realm of human possibility that they could have used this hull, the answer is, well, yes, it was sailing at that time. And that one discovery helps us enormously in trying to interpret what was taking place with various seascape episodes in the Gospels. For example, another question I asked back in Sunday school days, indeed, in connection with the stilling of the tempest was this. I was impressed, of course, that Jesus could turn off the wind and the storm, that sort of thing, but my question, was, how could he actually sleep then through a storm? Well, now we have the answer. The only sheltered place in that boat hull was in the stern, because in the stern there was decking on which the helmsman would stand to guide the ship, and that was the platform from which he would cast his nets. And therefore, underneath that decking would be the only place where there would be darkness, where it would be out of the wind and the wave and the cold and the wet, and Jesus would be able to sleep. Now, St. Mark's Gospel adds an interesting phrase. It says that Jesus was asleep in the stern of the boat on the pillow. The pillow. Direct article is used, definite article, I should say, was used, not the indefinite. And Greek is very much like English. If it would have been any run-of-the-mill cushion or pillow, it would have read, he was asleep on a pillow. But Mark says the pillow. He's implying that it's part of the boat's rigging. Now, what might that be? Well, it turns out that this hull could either be sailed or rowed. There is the remains of where the mast block should have gone in the front part of the ship. And this is unusual, of course. You don't find hulls like that anymore today, because if you're committed to being a rowboat, you're not going to be able to hoist a sail on that. Why? It would turn over with the wind. That's why sailboat hulls have to have a special item, the keel or the centerboard. But hold it. There's another way to do this, and that is the use of a ballast sack. What you can do in a wind, if the wind is steady, is peg up on the ribs of the ship a ballast sack that would change the center of gravity. So when the wind came along, you'd peg it up on the windward side, however high you have to have it, and that would stabilize the craft. Now, a storm is coming in the Sea of Galilee, and by the way, storms can really whip up there pretty fiercely. Again, you're not going to have Atlantic or Pacific waves or something like that, but they had very shallow draft fishing boats in those days, so they could haul the nets in and out of the gunnels very easily. And so when you have a wave over a couple feet or so, this could be very, very serious. Now, a storm is coming up. At that point, do you raise the sails or do you lower them? You lower them quickly. Therefore, you no longer need the ballast sack, do you? So what do you do with it? It's in the way now, and so instead you park it in the stern of the ship, out of your way. And so the fine-tuning in this famous episode of Jesus stilling the tempest runs like this. Jesus was asleep in the stern of the ship, lying on a ballast sack. Now, is this the sort of information you need for your soul's salvation? No, of course not. But it's one little example of how we can take a familiar episode from Jesus' Galilean ministry and, by using the latest evidence, fine-tune that picture over a 20th century period. Now, usually it doesn't work that way. Usually it's a case of the further removed you are from the object of your research, the tougher the research is. And the nearer you are, the better. That's why it's very important that the Gospels were written rather early and soon after the events they report. So one would think that 20 long centuries later, we would get only a hazy view. But almost miraculously, it doesn't work out that way. Because of 2,000 years of good biblical research, and because of the blessings of that young discipline called archaeology, we now have, with these exciting discoveries, a way of fine-tuning the image. And I think it's just wonderful that it's happening right on God's own schedule, evidently, because as the literature of attack or as the sensationalist reconstructions of the life of Jesus come along and clutter up the atmosphere, it's so pleasant to have these additional ways of easily defending the faith and the veracity and reliability of the gospel records. If our series were long enough, we would be able to take this particular method of using geography and history and archaeology and all its many correlations and go through the entire ministry of Jesus. But we probably should hurry on to the culmination of Jesus' whole career on earth, and that would be the events of Holy Week, the Lenten season, the first Lenten season, Passion Week in Jerusalem. One thing is very clear in the Gospel of John. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but what threw the plot against Jesus into high gear was the raising of Lazarus. Now this is quite clear from the Gospel of John. And one wonders why. Weren't the priests aware of what Jesus was doing before this? Of course they were. But the raising of Lazarus embarrassed them terribly. Why? Because this ultimate sign of Jesus, and I think you'd have to agree that raising somebody from the dead would have to be the ultimate sign, had been done only twice before, according to the Gospels, at least specifically, up in Galilee. You recall the raising of the young man of Nain and the raising of the daughter of Jairus. Now, because these great events took place in Galilee, we have to remember that this cut no ice down in Judea. Why not? Because there was a tremendous rivalry between the Judean Jews and the Galilean Jews. The Judeans regarded the Galileans up there in the North Country as a rebellious bunch who never learned to speak the language straight, who were the butt of all kinds of jokes. The hillbillies from the North Country. Most Judean jokes began, "Did you hear what one Galilean said to the other?" and so on. You recall when Jesus was arrested and brought into the courtyard of Caiaphas, that one of the maids kidded St. Peter about his Galilean twang. That clearly shows there was a different way in which they were speaking the Aramaic. So again, if reports came down to Judea that Jesus had raised the young man of Nain or daughter of Jairus, they would simply laugh. It wouldn't prove anything as far as the Judean Jews were concerned. But the raising of Lazarus took place in the eastern suburb of Jerusalem, Bethany, just over the Mount of Olives. And this great event was witnessed not just by Jesus' friends, but by his opponents as well. And you recall they, in a panic, went back to Caiaphas. Remember, he's the one whose bones have just been discovered. And they said, "What are we going to do if this man continues doing these wonderful works? The Romans will come and destroy our city and our temple." And Caiaphas stood up and said, "You don't know what you're talking about. It's expedient that one man should die and the nation not perish." And from that day forward, they sought to arrest Jesus. And that, by the way, is when they published that now famous arrest notice. He shall be stoned because he's practiced sorcery, and so on. This put the Passion story into high gear. Nain, tiny town, meant nothing to the Judean Jews. To this day, if you visit the Holy Land, you almost have to beg your guide to show you where Nain is, because it's in the Galilean hill country just south of the plain of Jezreel. And I think the last time I was there was a Christian church to mark that great event, three houses, and that was it. Tiny town to the present day yet, filling that familiar definition of a small town. That's a place where when you plug in your electric razor, the streetlights go dim. Very, very small place. So it doesn't count. Bethany, on the other hand, was a major suburb, witnessed by Jesus' friends and his enemies. Is there anything from history or archaeology or the other disciplines that we try to bring in from the side which will prove the raising of Lazarus from the dead? Well, I have no absolute proof, of course, because if I did, then the whole world would go Christian and so on, and evidently there are quite a few doubters around yet. But archaeology gives us a little clue, I think. The tomb of Lazarus is still very visible in Bethany. It's properly deep in the earth. It's 20 feet down. And all archaeologists and scholars agree this was a first century burial tomb. And whether or not it's Lazarus, I guess won't be finally provable. But it's sufficiently deep in the earth, and by the way, if you ever go to the Holy Land, that's always a gauge of authenticity. If something is not 13 or 14 feet lower in Jerusalem today, it's not authentic. You can prove that at the northwestern gate of Jerusalem, the Damascus gate. You can see the Damascus gate today is in street level, but just look over the eastern side of the sidewalk and you can see Hadrian's Damascus gate, 13, 14 feet down. Why is Jerusalem so much higher today? Because the place has been destroyed and rebuilt 13 times since the day of Jesus of Nazareth. And so when they show you the upper room today where Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, it's still an upper room. And so right there, you know it's not authentic. And if you still think it's authentic, climb inside and you will see that the ceiling has Gothic arches, and the Gothic arch will not be invented for 11 centuries after the Last Supper. So whenever I take a group to the Holy Land, I have a handy-dandy scale for authenticity, 1 to 10 scale. 1 means forget about it, 10, absolutely authentic. I'm a little skittish about my use of 10s. I think I use that only for the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, and so on. And as far as the concerned, we have a 0. The tomb of Lazarus, it's been identified at that spot since the 2nd century. So that's probably a good 8. Now here's something even more spectacular. Bethany changed its name. Today it's back again to Bethany. Bethania is the name in Hebrew. But if you ask an Arab where Bethany is located, he won't be able to tell you. Why not? Because the name is not Bethany in Arabic, it's Al-Eizariya, which means the place of Lazarus. That's fascinating. So I went back and did some research on when that name change took place. It turns out that Eusebius, the first great Christian church historian, who lived in Caesarea on the seacoast, where Pilate's administrative headquarters were located, and he wrote that when he visited the Jerusalem area, and he wrote a book called the Onomasticon, that simply means the naming of various places topographically. He said already in his day, in the 200s, Bethany was no longer Bethany, but it was called the place of Lazarus. Now, again, that doesn't prove the raising of Lazarus, but I think that is pretty fascinating. Why would you ever change the name of a town unless something absolutely spectacular happened there? Reverse that. If Lazarus were truly raised from the dead, well, we would expect something like this, wouldn't we? I'll tell you another place where this applies. You remember Saul on the road to Damascus gets the vision of the risen Christ and converts to Christianity. You remember that? Well, interestingly enough, again, you will not believe this, but although Damascus is the totally pan-Arab capital of Syria, the southwestern suburb of Damascus to the present day is called Darayya, which means the vision. I visited first there as a student many years ago. And as we were driving into Damascus, about noon, no, it didn't happen to me, we noticed that in a sea of minarets, there was a Christian cross over a dome. I couldn't believe there was a Christian church in this sea of Islam. And so we went over and talked to a Catholic priest who had a chapel there, and we asked him how in the world he could hope to do mission work in a totally Arab area. And he says, well, we have to have a presence here. And we asked him why. He said, Darayya. We said, yeah, that's the name of the village. What does it mean? And he told us the vision. And then skeptically we said, oh, sure, the vision of the Apostle Paul? And he grew very serious and said, yes. And then we asked him how old that name change was. all the way back to the 1st century AD. So you see, sometimes even if the stones don't cry out, the town names do. We have a way, even from the geographical considerations, of seeing how this fallout takes place. Now, to be sure, there's no way, I think, that a historian today is able to guarantee something miraculous. We weren't there to witness it with our own eyes. But what we do measure is the fallout. We get there with our academic Geiger counters, as it were, and we sample what may have happened as a result of the purported supernatural. And then we weigh the evidence that results. In many ways, I think ancient historians, these strange creatures, have to be first cousin to detectives, because we have to make do with whatever clues there may be in terms of reconstructing what happened. So, again, I'll say it. There will be additional forthcoming hints which will impinge, I think, directly on the biblical record and give us a clearer view of what's taking place. The raising of Lazarus. And by the way, there may have been more than 3 occasions in which Jesus raised the dead. There are references to Jesus raising others from the dead who are not named. The most important raising of the dead, of course, will happen to Jesus himself in connection with the Easter account. So there's an all-points bulletin, you might say, out, not only for Jesus in the arrest notice, but the Gospel of John also tells us, in many ways, that Lazarus was also in their crosshairs, so to speak. They wanted to arrest Lazarus as an embarrassment, because everybody knew he was dead, and here he was. And once again, how do you explain this? You can't unless you acknowledge Jesus having divine power, unless, once again, you put the bad spin on it and say he does this with the help of the devil. And that's how Lazarus came back to life. In any case, they want to eliminate him as Exhibit A, you might say, for the person that they really do want to arrest, which is Jesus. According to Jewish rabbinical tradition, whenever such an arrest would take place, a crier had to go throughout the length and breadth of the land for 40 days and announce, Yeshua Hanotzri shall be stoned because he's practiced sorcery, and say and post the words of that arrest notice, which we discussed in a previous segment. And it's quite interesting that even our Lenten observation is 40 days. That's just coincidental. But I consider it very interesting that they can't just go arrest Jesus unless it's going to be a proper legal length of time, and if it's not a lynch action. A lynch mob, of course, can do whatever it wishes. I give you the case of the first Christian martyr after Jesus. That would be Stephen, who was taken out and stoned. You recall the Roman governor was not around at that time, and for that reason they could stone him to death. In the next segment, we're going to try to solve a big problem. A problem that, I don't know, I was worried about ever since Sunday school days. And I can recall asking my Sunday school teacher, how could people sing Hosanna to the Son of David on Palm Sunday, and then 5 short days later scream crucify? I can recall the Sunday school teacher answering, well, for once you've asked a good question, Paul. The answer is simple. People change their minds. Okay? Then, years later, when I was attending the university, I asked a New Testament professor the same question, and he smiled and gazed pontifically out the window at the woods, and he said, well, that's easy to answer. People change their minds. After all those years, the same answer. I really don't think that is the proper answer, and we'll try to solve that problem. As a matter of fact, and this is only going to complicate it, I think quite oppositely that Jesus, instead of losing popularity one day after another during Holy Week is only gaining it.